I'm Dr. Tommy Kidd. I'm the Associate Director of the Institute for Studies of Religion, which is sponsoring our lecture today. If you don't know, the Institute sponsors a lot of work across the disciplines here at Baylor. We have all kinds of people who study various topics in religion, epidemiology, psychology, philosophy, history. There's a lot of important work going on at Baylor in many areas of the study of religion. And of course, some of our focus is on the history of religion, which brings us together today. And I want to introduce our speaker, Dr. Larry Eskridge, and he is the author of God's Forever Family, the Jesus People Movement in America, which came out with Oxford University Press in 2013. It's the basis for his lecture today. And for 25 years, Dr. Eskridge worked at Wheaton College's Institute for the Study of American Evangelicals, and he also taught sometimes in Wheaton's history and Bible and theology departments. He's a native of North Carolina, which is partly accounts for our friendship as fellow Carolina boys, but he was raised in the Chicago area, and he wants you to know, he grew up Southern Baptist. And he says, I consistently scored between 90 and 100% on my weekly Sunday school offering envelopes. That's what he said. So that locates him a bit. Dr. Eskridge did his doctorate with David Bebbington at the University of Stirling in Scotland. And many of you know and have even had classes with Dr. Bebbington. Dr. Bebbington is a longtime friend of Baylor. And has often taught here at Baylor as visiting distinguished professor of history. So we have that connection with David Bebbington too. God's Forever Family, you may know, was the winner of Christianity's 2014 Book of the Year award, not just the best history book, but the best book overall that year according to Christianity Today. I was one of the prize panelists for that competition, so I know it was the best book of the year in their award, and it won a couple other major awards too. It was one of the top 10 most intriguing books of 2013 by Religion News Service, and it was also the winner of the Religion News Writers Association's 2014 Nonfiction Book of the Year. So. Not only has it attracted attention in religious history, but also in the media, and I think you'll find this to be a very engaging presentation about the Jesus People, an extremely important movement in American religious history. So, Dr. Eskridge, thank you for coming.
Well, thanks. Good afternoon. Great to be with you. I'd like to take a quick opportunity to thank the Institute for the Study of Religion, particularly Dr. Kidd, who I think bears most of the blame, credit for this invitation to come down here to Waco from all the way up in deepest, darkest Wheaton, Illinois, to talk to you about Jesus movement, the Jesus movement, and the Baptists. This afternoon we're going to look back at the rise of one of the most visible and highly publicized of a series of evangelical revitalization movements that took place in the 1960s and 1970s, and is part of a larger story that revamps what most Americans have in their minds when they think about the story of the counterculture in the 1960s. We're going to look at the Jesus People movement with a particular eye to the perhaps surprising role that Baptists of various stripes, and particularly Southern Baptists, played in this cultural happening. Now, for the few people who are present of my generation, they're familiar with the Jesus movement very possibly, maybe actually involved with it at one level or another back in the day. But for the younger folks here, or perhaps, as they say, those who were immersed in other cultural worlds at that time, I'm going to give you a quick thumbnail image, some images of the Jesus People that will help you give you a sense of the Jesus movement and the surprising reach within American culture that it had during a period ranging from about 1968 to 1977. So just going to go through some images here to give you an idea about just what the ethos of this thing was like. And this is a service in Southern California, some kids at a rally in the Midwest. these guys are awesome, just in every way. I mean, you know that with 2 months before this picture was taken, their biggest moment was probably hanging in line in front of a record store waiting for the release of Led Zeppelin 3. You know, so, witnessing at a rock concert. This was part of the. Yeah. One of the big visual images of the Jesus movement were ocean baptisms, particularly on the West Coast, especially those run by Calvary Chapel in Costa Mesa, California. This is at Pirates Cove, Corona del Mar. Monthly, for a couple of years, they would have baptism services that would baptize 400 or 500 people every month, and on 1 or 2 occasions, they baptized over 1,000 people during one of these events. And just some of the 2 of the major figures associated with Calvary Chapel, Chuck Smith and Lonnie Frisbee, the hippie preacher, at one of these ocean baptisms, flashing the one-way sign, which was the kind of, the peace sign equivalent of the Jesus people, was one way. Jesus people rally in Milwaukee in early 71. Here's a street theater group, the Holy Ghost Players, in Chicago, Japuza, Jesus People USA, in the mid-70s. Just sort of get a bit of the ethos here, a trailer owned by the Jesus People Army in Spokane, which is one of the biggest groups in the Pacific Northwest. One of the phenomenons of the Jesus movement was the Jesus March, where you'd get together and, like the anti-war marches and other marches, you would go and show your participants in Cincinnati. Here's one in Anchorage, Alaska in 72. This is one of the biggest ones, Spiritual Revolution Day, March for Jesus, Sacramento. They marched on the California state capitol, and there's about 7,000 or 8,000 of these people heading out there. One of the major institutions of the Jesus movement, the Coffee House. And this one looks like it was probably stocked at Jesus People Corporate Center, because it's got, they all looked like this, it seemed like, with the spool tables and the candles. Here's another one, the Fire Escape. You love these names that they came up with. Here's one, kind of a teenage hangout, the Glory Barn in East Peoria, Illinois. The communal house was another aspect of the Jesus movement that had a lot of appeal. Coming out of the counterculture, they wanted to live in communes, and also coming out of the book of Acts, chapter 2. We live together and hold all things in common. This is one in Oregon. The Jesus People street paper borrowed a page out of the underground newspapers of the hippies. This is Dust out of the Buffalo, New York area. And you read up here, it says, "Stop marching for peace and start marching for Jesus, and peace will take care of itself." And then they have a quote in here from Henry David Thoreau, in the middle of the thing. It says, "I will look for a change in the state of world affairs when I see a change in the inner man." So that dovetails perfectly with that one. Here's another one, the Hollywood Free Paper. This was the most popular one, had different drop editions all across the country. Here's maybe my favorite headline of all time. Amen, brother. Pop culture and advertising world. They took a page out of the hippies as well, and sort of appropriated popular advertising for their fan. Have a nice forever. Companies came into existence to supply the Jesus people with bric-a-brac, bumper stickers, posters, what have you. This is the poster that hung on 1 million bedroom and church youth group rooms across the nation. The Wanted Jesus Christ poster, which itself was actually a takeoff on a early 20th century radical poster that had been published back by the socialists. Music was a huge part of the Jesus movement and its appeal. It's one of the earliest Jesus rock bands, Agape, in West Covina, California. Another one, ubiquitous. One of the most important bands, Love Song, out of Calvary Chapel in Costa Mesa. And they were pretty influential. Second chapter of Acts, another group that came out of this. This was before they hit it big, actually, in 1973. The grandfather of Christian rock, Larry Norman, was an influential guy. He was very popular. And you can see the impact of some of these people on having rock music available that was Christian in nature. It was just, oh, yes. How big was the Jesus movement? Cover of Time magazine in June 1971. So that was a cultural happening for them to sort of admit that. High watermark of the Jesus movement, just to show you, up in Dallas, Campus Crusade for Christ ran a student evangelism program that turned into a Jesus People thing, attracted 85,000 people for a week of meetings. Again, cover of Life magazine. America's most famous Baptist, Billy Graham, spoke at the music festival on the concluding day that attracted 180,000 people up in Dallas. And Billy Graham was a very big backer of the Jesus movement. He wrote a book, The Jesus Generation, sold well over 500,000 copies. And just to give you an idea, so this was a thing, this Jesus movement. Not an isolated sort of a phenomenon. It was a national story. If you're to boil it down to its core, what you have is a process whereby the hippie counterculture and its various substrata, here you're talking drug culture and associated rock music culture, come into contact with the widespread grassroots presence of evangelical Christianity. It's important to grasp the two-way nature of this interaction. It's not just the hippies finding Jesus, it's also the church, and in our case today, Baptists, sometimes dragged kicking and screaming, finding the hippies, and to a larger extent coming to grips with youth culture and what that all meant. The collision of the meeting produced what was certainly perceived at the time as a rather strange hybrid entity. The Jesus People, who it turned out had a strong appeal also to conservative church kids who were hungry for relevance and, as it turns out, the forbidden fruit of rock music and popular culture. Certainly, given the lay of the land at the time, nobody would have expected evangelical Christians or Baptists with having any natural affinity for or interest in people who were so far on the other side of the cultural barricades at that particular time in the late 60s, early 70s. Yet it would turn out, of all the segments of the establishment, only these conservative evangelical Christians at that point could really point to having secured a sizable hearing with a degree of relevance to a large segment of youth during the period. So in that way, they were, did have some bragging rights. As one Jesus freak put it in 1971, God is blowing everyone's minds because he's saving the hippies, and no one thought that a hippie could be saved. One might add, no one would have thought necessarily a Baptist could save a hippie. So that was a two-way street. So while the Jesus movement flamed out within less than a decade, it nonetheless had long-lasting effects at the grassroots level. You can look to, for example, how the rise and acceptance of Jesus music morphed into CCM, or contemporary Christian music. There's the manner in which the new folky praise choruses within Jesus People ranks influenced the rise of contemporary worship on Sunday morning. And then there's the way in which the more laid-back worship styles and assemblies of the Jesus movement help lead to the rise of seeker-sensitive, casual, come-as-you-are churches. Finally, the Jesus People marked an embrace of a baptized form of popular youth culture that really set up a new template for the way in which individual churches and the wider evangelical world could address that whole third rail of youth culture and pop culture. All of those trends were either introduced or greatly strengthened by the coming of the Jesus movement. Looking back on the Jesus People from this historical vantage point, one of the first things that strikes observers of this episode of church history, as you saw these slides, was how very Pentecostal the whole thing looks. Images from the movement, as we've already seen, are awash with Pentecostal worship style and body language. Emphases on the gifts of the Spirit and the baptism of the Holy Spirit were an integral part of the movement. The fact that the most influential and important religious body to have emerged from the Jesus People, Calvary Chapel of Costa Mesa, which spawned a network of hundreds of churches across the country, were charismatic in nature. That points more of the direction the movement took, and which is squared by the fact that one of the most effervescent signs and wonders heavy groups in recent American Christian memory, the Vineyard International, emerged out of Calvary Chapel. So there's a heavily Pentecostal milieu within the movement. In an online survey, when you begin to question how heavy was this Pentecostal influence, took an online survey, admittedly not scientific, I'll be the first to say here, but we had over 800 people surf in to take this survey. 76% claimed to have experienced the baptism in the Holy Spirit. 72% claimed to have spoken in tongues. and almost 40% claim to have been slain in the Spirit during their time as Jesus people. Now, given that sort of a picture, it may come as little more than a bit of a surprise to realize that Baptists were found throughout this movement, played a key role in getting it off the ground, and were particularly important to the acceptance of the movement as a legitimate vehicle through which to reach high school-age kids, particularly middle-class church kids. It was thus when the religion editor of the Detroit Free Press, Hiley Ward, toured several dozen Jesus communes in early 1970 and 71 for his book, The Far Out Saints of the Jesus Communes. He came away with the distinct impression that there was a strong Baptist minority that was, quote, striving to win out in the Jesus people movement, that had an emphasis on an eternal security and can't stand tongue speaking. In our time that remains, we're going to look at some of the Baptist roots of the Jesus people, some of the fascinating figures that were part of that, and how Baptists attempted to steer and utilize the Jesus freaks for their own evangelistic efforts. Now, the sort of interaction between hippies and evangelical Christian folk that rose up, that was eventually labeled the Jesus movement, seems to have sprung up in several places within a general period of time during 1967 and 68. But if you wanted to pick a likely spot for the beginning of the Jesus people movement, you couldn't do much better than going back to 1967, to San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district and the Summer of Love. There, a group of turned-on, LSD-imbibing proto-hippies connected to a middling-sized American Baptist church in Marin County, California, pastored by a Wheaton College classmate of Billy Graham. Since the early 50s, San Francisco had been the center of a growing avant-garde bohemian population that came to be associated with the beat, or as it came to be more popularly known, the beatnik movement. It was that atmosphere that attracted a young couple named Ted and Elizabeth Wise to the city in the late 50s. Ted had picked up the trade of sail-making during a stint in the Navy, as well as a taste for marijuana, heroin, and peyote, and some other assorted substances. Both he and Elizabeth were bright, interested in things literary, and so a commune on O'Farrell Street in San Francisco's North Beach district seemed like the place for them. Eventually, they and their two kids moved across the bridge to Sausalito to follow Ted's sail-making work. It was about that time that he began to be involved in the buzz surrounding the chemical lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD, the then still legal substance that was increasingly being touted by the visionary bohemian sort as a revolutionary gateway to personal enlightenment. He tried the drug and found it to be, quote, a phenomenal experience. He often liked to go to work in the morning with a little bit of an LSD enhancement, for as he said, quote, small doses were very interesting. Yeah, sail. On the outside, everything was looking pretty groovy in Ted Wise's world by late 1965, but despite this edgy, hip lifestyle, Ted's habit of sleeping with other women proved to be something of a problem for his wife. It became such a problem in the Wise household that, in fact, Ted later confessed he actually began kicking around the idea of murdering his old lady. It was about at this time that a desperately unhappy Elizabeth began to turn back to the Baptist faith of her childhood, and while high on LSD on Sunday mornings, started dropping in at the Sunday morning services at the First Baptist Church of Mill Valley, California. The church's pastor was a California native, the Reverend John McDonald. This picture's from about 1960 or so, but you can tell he's like the ideal conduit to the hippies, you would think. He had attended Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia, as well as the American Baptist Seminary in Berkeley. And after serving a few congregations, he came to Mill Valley in 1960. It was a very prosperous, arty community in Marin County. His pastoring went fairly smoothly. By the mid-60s, he'd built up a respectable congregation of about 200. So he and the people in the church made a point of welcoming this quiet young woman, Liz Wise, who kept coming back and who began asking them to pray for her husband. To make a long but great story short, the unchurched Ted noticed a change in his wife's demeanor, checked out the Bible, and really liked this Jesus he read about. he seemed completely different from the stained glass window image that the squares put out there. And then on one post-New Testament reading LSD trip, a new insight arrived. He became increasingly convinced that at bottom, Ted Wise was a self-centered liar, cheat, and thief. As he put it, quote, "I went into the palace looking for the prince on the throne, but discovered only the rat in the basement." Convinced that Jesus was God, Wise later described his experience as a Paul-like conversion. He said, "While on my way to my own Damascus, I found it necessary to cry out to God to save my life in every sense of the word. Jesus knocked me off my metaphysical ass." Wise soon showed up one Sunday morning on the Baptist church, at the Baptist church after a rather harrowing LSD trip, came forward and cryptically announced to the puzzled congregation, "He's back." In the weeks and months ahead, Wise became what he later described as a, quote, "dues-paying, meeting-going, praying out loud member of the First Baptist Church." As time went by, the Wises began to reach out to some of their bohemian friends with the invitation to check out this Jesus, and eventually they formed their own little avant-garde Christian circle. Open at first, many within MacDonald's tradition-minded flock had difficulty adjusting to their pastor's growing ministry among Marin County's free spirits. Much of the conflict stemmed from their readiness to ask questions that skirted assumptions and Sunday school pieties that they held unquestionably. But the irritation cut both ways. Wise and his friends had trouble understanding how longtime self-professed Christians could read the Bible and be unmoved by Christ's teachings, or so thoroughly miss the point of a scripture passage. Reminiscing years later, Wise recalled thinking that, quote, "these church folks were not at all like the people I'd read about in the book of Acts." When thousands of kids drifted into San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district in the summer of 1967, and there were about 75,000, they estimated, that came into the city just during those summer months. Wise and his friends attempted to bring the overcrowding, hunger, lack of housing, and unsanitary conditions to the church's attention. They approached Pastor McDonald with a plan for First Baptist to help the kids on the street by simply turning over the Mill Valley Church building to house and feed kids. McDonald couldn't see the rest of the congregation putting up with that, but he did want to do something. So he agreed to accompany Wise on a tour of the Haight. Going down into the hippie district, the Baptist pastor was moved by what he saw as they walked along. Sauntering along the streets and ducking into hippie businesses, McDonald became more and more aware of what was actually going on. In Wise's word, this was his first understanding that he was a square. At bottom, he began to see the Haight as every bit as much a cross-cultural evangelistic field as any tribal land overseas. The hippie enclave deserved the attention of the institutional church, but it and he was utterly unequipped to pull it off. So while he still had some qualms about Wise and his friends, McDonald rang up the pastors of the First Baptist Church of San Francisco and Presidio Park Baptist Church and some other evangelical friends to see what could be done. They quickly cobbled together a nonprofit organization they dubbed Evangelical Concerns, secured an empty storefront in the old Armenian Hall that was roughly a block north of the intersection of Haight and Ashbury Streets near the panhandle of Golden Gate Park. This is prime hippie territory. Wise was given a small stipend to become your missionary to the hippie. That's out of this brochure they published. Brochures were printed up touting the group's goals. The storefront was equipped with a couple of tables, some chairs, a refrigerator, and a hot plate. They put up some Bible verses and artwork, and the living room coffee house was born. For close to 2 years, the Page Street Living Room mission would prove to be a haven for wandering young people. Borrowing a page from the long-established routines of Skid Row missions, they attracted kids with a chance to trade food and then expose their clientele to the gospel. At the mission, the bare minimum of that translated to quietly eating your soup while someone read from Good News for Modern Man, the New American Bible Society translation. Here's a few shots. These guys didn't take pictures, sadly. It was expensive back in the day before phones. Here they are on the street, some of the group. The guy, the second guy on the left, was one of the major rock disc jockeys in San Francisco. He was part of the group, and he was the guy who actually was responsible for getting Janis Joplin signed to Columbia Records. So, it's an interesting bunch. Well, and just here they are on the streets hanging out. The living room coffee house lasted only until the spring of 1969, as the four original couples in the group began to pull apart and go their separate ways. But the impact of the living room was nonetheless significant. This is some national attention they got in church circles, Christian Life magazine, major evangelical periodical. You gotta love the headline, Psychedelic Christians. That got some attention. The letters to the editor the next 3 or 4 months were beautiful. The impact of the living room was said was significant. One of their converts was Southern California native Lonnie Frisbee, who we saw the slide of, who went on to become a key figure in the growth of Calvary Chapel, the largest entity to emerge from the Jesus movement. And if you triangulate the accounts of various people associated with the living room, it's not a stretch to think they may have managed contact with well over 20,000 young people before the effort shut down. While the living room closed, the Baptist pastors of evangelical concerns continued to drum up support and a measure of oversight for a welter of new hip Christian houses and groups in the greater Bay Area that had started up. Most were under the guidance of a 25-year-old Southern Baptist seminarian named Kent Philpott and his ex-Hare Krishna lieutenant, David Hoyt. Philpott had grown up in Oregon and Southern California, was converted at a Baptist church, and then enrolled at Southern Baptist Golden Gate Seminary, which was in Mill Valley, California, oddly enough. While he had struck a course for a traditional career in the Baptist ministry, Philpott's curiosity was piqued by the increasing coverage of what was going on with the hippies in Haight-Ashbury. Philpott journeyed into the Haight one night in April 1967 after hearing Scott McKenzie's recently released song, San Francisco, Be Sure to Wear Flowers in Your Hair, on the radio. And while the major influx of young seekers and runaway was yet to come, what Philpott saw of the ragged, dirty kids on the street during the supposed height of the hippie revolution shocked him. He kept coming back, roaming the streets, witnessing to hippies and helping runaways contact their parents and get back home. His ministry became of special interest to a new faculty member at Golden Gate. Dr. Francis DeBose was a professor of missions who had a particular heart for what would later come to be known as urban ministry. He thought that what Philpott was doing was the exact role that the church should be playing in the city, and as a mentor he encouraged Philpott's efforts and tried to draw other Golden Gate students into his effort. Eventually, on one of Philpott's sojourns into the Haight, he came into contact with a slight blonde-haired, bearded young Krishna devotee named David Hoyt. Hoyt was a Southern California native who had served 2 years in prison, where he had gotten heavily into Zen Buddhism, Scientology, and LSD. Upon release, he landed in the Haight and came under the influence of Swami Bhaktivedanta, who had begun the new San Francisco outlet of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. After several rounds of discussion about their beliefs, the bespectacled Baptist seminarian was invited to host a Bible study on Galatians that ended up taking place on the premises of the Krishna temple itself. One night, Hoyt had a vision where he saw Jesus gathering people from every country and race, and while Christ began to raise everyone else from the surface of the earth, he was going nowhere. Hoyt was staying right there. A subsequent fire in his quarters burned all his belongings except for a Bible that Philpott had given him. That was kind of the final push. As the Krishnas were cleaning up from the fire, Hoyt painted this message on the wall in 6-inch high letters. I have found the true and living God, and I thank you, Lord Jesus, for saving my soul. Lord, help me to follow you faithfully every day. Ousted from the Krishna temple, Hoyt went home with Philpott to live with him in seminary housing and to begin discipling in the rudiments of the Christian faith. Still bearded, he would spend his days wandering around the Golden Gate campus, nearly usually dressed all in white, munching on Krishna snacks and dropping into classes mysteriously. Who's this guy? In the evenings, he would accompany Philpott on evangelistic treks down into San Francisco. At one point, they tried to get him admitted into California Baptist College down in Riverside, but Hoyt's appearance and very serious demeanor was too much for the college administration, and they said, no, we don't think so. After whipping together a Christian drug rehab commune in Lancaster, a very entrepreneurial guy, Hoyt headed back to the Bay Area to reunite with Philpott. By the time he got there in late '68, DuBose had convinced Al Gossett, the pastor of Lincoln Park Baptist Church, a little storefront church where DuBose worshiped, to consider giving Philpott and Hoyt a hand with their work with the hippies. Philpott had already been camping out there frequently, keeping his sleeping bag rolled up under the pulpit and sleeping on the platform at nights after his witnessing forays. But now the little church took an extra step and set up 2 Sunday school rooms with borrowed furnishings, and Hoyt and Philpott hung a sign outside for the Soul Inn. With a capacity of about 20, the Soul Inn would serve as a part shelter, part halfway house for the next year and a half. During this time, Philpott became something of a grade B celebrity in local Baptist churches, and he made appearances at youth retreats, summer camps for the SBC, and the California State Convention. He and Hoyt also started working occasionally with the Living Room Group, Ted Wise and company, and they also attracted concern under the Evangelical Concerns Group that John MacDonald had started. They soon opened up a new communal shelter for girls, Zion's Inn, in suburban San Rafael, followed by several other communal houses sprinkled around the bay. But problems had begun to arise between Philpott and his Baptist mentors. One night while he was sacked out on the platform of Lincoln Park Baptist, Philpott was praying, and he was suddenly overcome with a tidal wave of emotions and, seemingly out of nowhere, began to speak in tongues. This was a major sticking point for his friend Francis DuBose, who also had some growing reservations about the authoritarian zeal he detected in David Hoyt. For Philpott, who received his MDiv in 1968, his glossolalia speaking eventually meant that he was bounced out of a THM program without earning a degree. Philpott and DuBose remained friends, but Philpott increasingly did his own thing. Somewhat ironically, I guess, David Hoyt and his some Bay Area associates were invited to tour some Southern Baptist churches in the South in late 1969. And in early 1970, they were taken under the wing of the First Baptist Church of Decatur, Georgia, who sponsored the establishment of the House of Judah in Atlanta to reach the city's growing hippie and drug cultures. And went on, they established several more houses in Atlanta, houses in Chattanooga, Nashville, Gainesville, Florida, a bunch of places in the South during the 1970 and 71. While the Bay Area was the first major outpost of what would become the Jesus movement, its epicenter quickly shifted to Southern California, where a full-blown Jesus people culture arose during 1969 and early 1970. There you had places like the Hollywood Presbyterian Church's Salt Company nightclub, the Lighthouse Teen Club in Huntington Beach, run by the soon-to-be discredited David Berg of Children of God fame and infamy, as well as the aforementioned Calvary Chapel. All these groups served as kind of seed beds for the creation of dozens of communal houses, coffee houses, and hippie Christian groups. But the first major figure to emerge in the region with the outreach to the hippie, drug, and runaway culture was a young Mississippi-bred Southern Baptist preacher named Arthur Blessett, who established a mission coffee house in Los Angeles called His Place. From his high school years, Blessett was set upon becoming an evangelist. He attended Mississippi College but couldn't contain his urge to preach. He left without graduating, ended up as a pastor of a tiny church in Anaconda, Montana. In 1964, he headed to San Francisco and was accepted as a special student at Golden Gate Seminary. Unlike Kent Philpott, however, Blessett was not impressed with the school. He said, quote, "Seminary was a disappointment." And to his mind, most of his professors and fellow students were, quote, "cold in spirit and arch liberals." Much more concerned with evangelizing treks into San Francisco's nightclub and Tenderloin districts, he left Golden Gate after a semester, headed to Nevada, worked with several small churches for about a year and a half. In 1967, he made his way to Southern California, where he felt a call to labor amongst the drug addicts, hustlers, and runaways on the Sunset Strip. Along with his wife Sherry and a New Orleans-born Baptist preacher named Leo Humphrey, he began working the sidewalks, passing out tracts and sandwiches. Handsome, friendly, possessed of a quick smile and wit, Blessett had found his element. With a few donated dollars, he opened His Place in early 1968 in a shabby old motel on Sunset Boulevard, and later, with financial backing from some local Baptist pastors, secured a storefront as a base of operations. So with the help of free peanut butter sandwiches, day-old bagels, Kool-Aid, and a house combo called the Eternal Rush, Blessett fashioned a hip-friendly persona that proved effective in evangelizing kids and, perhaps just as important, generating publicity. In its heyday, sometimes as many as 1,000 kids a night would amble in from the moving sea of sidewalk traffic, chatting with Blessed and his staff of earnest Baptist preacher boys and born-again drug addicts. Here's I've got a couple of slides of his place in action. Armed with little red stickers and gospel tracts, Blessed and his helpers would urge hippies to turn on to Jesus, and instead of using LSD, to try dropping Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John for an eternal high that would never go away. One of the more colorful rituals at his place was something Blessed dubbed a toilet service, where those who had accepted the Lord would be escorted into the washroom and urged to drop their contraband into the toilet. Not all the drugs made it there, however. One time somebody decided to drop acid into a punch bowl, which sent dozens of the people there on an unplanned trip. In recognition of his efforts, Blessed began to garner a number of speaking gigs in L.A. area churches, almost all of them Southern Baptist. He urged his audiences to consider reaching out to the disaffected younger generation, but according to Blessed, it was often told by people that there was nothing at their church that would interest this class of young person, or just flat out they wanted nothing to do with, quote, hippies or anyone with a Negro background, unquote. In October of '68, Blessed was asked to be one of the speakers at the Continental Congress on Evangelism in Washington, D.C., that brought together over 1,200 representatives from 13 U.S. Baptist groups. In his session there, Blessed reiterated his frustration with the local churches that wouldn't take in his new converts from the Strip. Said Blessed, "They are afraid the converts will contaminate their kids." By mid-'69, Blessed was taking credit for having saved 10,000 young people and making life uncomfortable for the bars and strip joints, maybe more. When his lease was terminated, he accused the nightlife business interests and the police with trying to destroy his place. In Blessed's mind, it was, quote, a last-ditch attempt on the part of the establishment to sweep the Strip clean of hippies and turn it back into a happy hunting ground for straight drunks, unquote. To publicize his plight, Blessed plunked down a giant cross on the sidewalk and chained himself to it and began a hunger strike. The protest lasted for 28 days before a Jewish businessman stepped up to offer him a building. But in the meantime, Blessed had gained tremendous publicity, of course claimed he'd led hundreds to Christ on the sidewalk, and crowed that, quote, a determined soldier of the cross had defeated the generalissimos of greed who command the Strip. With more speaking engagements in hand, particularly within the concerts and rallies that had begun to mark what was now called a Jesus People movement in Southern California, Blessed soon became distracted and struck upon the idea of beginning a nationwide crosswalk. And on Christmas Day 1969, he set out from Los Angeles with the same cross he had used in his protest and started hoofing it all the way to Washington, D.C. Blessed would become famous for this crosswalking ministry, would take him around the world. He's still at it. His place would fade into the background and it would close during the early 70s. While Blessed and his place were gone, his efforts were important in helping nurture a growing counterculture-friendly vibe that would inspire others, lend publicity to the early days of the Jesus movement, and increasingly gained a hearing within evangelical and particularly Southern Baptist circles to the idea of rethinking the church's relationship to an increasingly alienated youth culture. And by mid-1970, there was increasing optimism about the youth situation, especially among the Southern Baptists. The denomination was seeing a dramatic uptick in baptisms among youth. In fact, because of youthful response, the SBC was embarking in 1970 on a 5-year run that would see the highest sustained number of annual baptisms in its history. There was also a new popularity of youth choirs, folk groups, and youth musicals, like Ralph Carmichael and Kurt Kaiser's Good News and Tell It Like It Is, that were packing out Sunday night church performances, and despite the fact that they had featured music that was part folk, part gospel, and part Hollywood musical stylings, didn't seem to be automatically alienating the parents and grandparents in the pews. So the pig and the python demographic reality that was the baby boom encouragingly seemed not to be running away from the faith of their parents in quite the way that the older Baptist generation might have feared, given the cultural turmoil that was going on at the time. And then, during 1970 and especially 1971, came news of this Jesus movement that was happening. For many Southern Baptist pastors and leaders, the opportunity to reap a potential harvest of young souls by linking up with long-haired Jesus freaks was too good to pass up. A number of SBC pastors like Ike Reinhardt in Fayetteville, Georgia, and Jess Moody in West Palm Beach, Florida, began to talk about the Jesus movement and began deploying hipper, edgier music in their churches' attempts to reach their kids. A particularly successful attempt to harness the image of the Jesus movement took place in Houston, where John Bisagno, the brand new pastor of the First Baptist Church, and I'm sorry, that's the best picture of a younger John Bisagno I could find from the 1960s, was concerned that traditional churches needed to get off the dime and connect with youth. Without a seminary degree and possessing a background as a trumpet-playing evangelist, and for those of you with any familiarity with 1950s and 1960s Baptist world, that was living on the Baptist cultural end as a trumpet evangelist on the edge there. Bisagno was armed with a budget of over $50,000, and he signed up one of his former assistant pastors at a church he had pastored in Oklahoma, a young fellow by the name of Richard Hogue, to begin an all-out evangelistic blitz in the Houston area in the fall of 1970. Dubbing the campaign Spirino, Spiritual Revolution Now, the meetings featured the long-haired, mod-dressed, hip-speaking 24-year-old Hogue at nearly 50 rallies at various high schools and junior highs. And that's, again, best picture I could get off of one of his book covers, but he's styling, you can tell. And he had a series of nightly meetings where Hogue would announce at these meetings, the Jesus movement is here. Utilizing with it publicity, Jesus cheers, a combo named Dove, Hogue and Bisagno intentionally stayed out of the churches for months until they felt the moment was right that they could begin to transition into the churches. If we just bend a little, I think we'll see the greatest spiritual revival there has ever been, Hogue told a journalist. But if this Jesus movement doesn't go, man, you can put it down that the churches blew it. Within 3 months' time, the Spirino rallies had registered some 4,000 professions of faith and performed over 600 baptisms. The rallies traveled, too. Over the next year plus, rallies took place in other cities in Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, I believe, and up in Ohio. Perhaps not surprisingly, the results began to beat back protests from a lot of conservatives. As Hogue later recalled, I don't know any Baptist who don't want to see folks get saved. You start winning folks to the Lord and baptizing them, they'll pretty well put up with your methods. For his part, Bisagno saw the need to utilize the Jesus movement as crucial, as he readily admitted that changes in the country caused him to be, quote, disturbed about the future. In the Jesus movement, he saw a potential bonanza for the church, but one which traditional congregations were in danger of letting slip through their hands. He said, unless the church can latch on to the Jesus movement, we are going to miss the greatest opportunity that we ever had. We had better accept these kids. But he was also concerned that the new Jesus people be brought along to a mature understanding of the faith, lest they spawn new cults and made up new rules as they went along. If this thing does not become church-centered, Bisagno stated in a 1971 interview, I'm afraid it will give rise to all manner of heresy, tongues, snake charmers, etc. There must be church-centered guidance. Sharing Bisagno's sense of optimism was Walker Knight, editor of the SBC Home Missions magazine. Here's a picture of a young Walker Knight, Baylor grad, by the way. For Knight, the Jesus movement was a move of God. He said, I have no doubt we are in the presence of a religious phenomenon within the youth culture. He wrote, like the revitalizing movements of history, this turning to Jesus is as fresh and new as dogwood blossoms in spring. Knight pumped the Jesus people for all they were worth, dedicating the entire June-July issue of Home Missions magazine to the movement, as well as compiling a dispatches from the front type of book called Jesus People Come Alive. It reported on various elements of youth-centered revival, including Calvary Chapel, Spirino, the New Jesus music, the 1970 Asbury College revival in Kentucky and its ripples, and even the soon-to-be thoroughly marginalized Children of God. In an article in the Arkansas Baptist News magazine, Knight urged older Baptists to maintain an open, uncritical attitude, refrain from condemning it for such unimportant manifestations as applause or cheering. This next line I love. Be flexible enough to allow joy and celebration to be expressed in new forms in worship services. Allow young people leadership roles, but do not permit deviations of doctrine. But make sure it's not culture or tradition you're defending. Provide for a free sharing of experiences, taking the risk that someone might drop a careless remark. Trust the young people to do any disciplining necessary. The Jesus movement that figures like John MacDonald and his Baptist pastor friends, Kent Philpott and Arthur Blessed had helped launch, and the movement to which figures like John Bisagno and Walker Knight looked with such hope would continue to swell and grow in the early 1970s. But for the most part, the movement dropped out of the headlines in the next year or two in both the secular and religious press, and eventually, by the mid to late 70s, the movement itself had pretty much dried up and blown away. There are a number of reasons for this. Certainly the novelty had worn off. There were financial problems that made it hard for Jesus People efforts to continue in the stagflation economy of the 1970s. The Jesus People themselves grew up and moved on with their lives. They went to school, married, had families, and started careers, and were in the process seamlessly absorbed into local Baptist, Pentecostal, and other evangelical congregations. Finally, the changes in the larger youth culture from the mid-70s forward made it harder for the Jesus People, with their heavy identification with the 60s counterculture, to stay relevant in a rapidly fracturing youth scene that was coming to be dominated by disco, punk, new wave, and heavy metal musical subcultures. The whole peace and love vibe didn't fit quite into that. But the impact of the movement continues to be felt in Baptist and evangelical churches, and not always as a universally hailed positive by any stretch. Since the days of the one-way button and the music of Larry Norman, Baptists for the most part and evangelicals more generally have largely jettisoned old attempts to completely isolate their kids from youth and the larger popular culture, and have increasingly opted to baptize it and create their own sanctified parallel equivalents. Skinny jeans, hipster beards, Christian death metal, and tats, you got 'em. In all these ways, the Jesus movement continues to carry on influence within American Christianity and within Baptist culture. But it also lingers in a nostalgic desire to see some new version of something akin to the Jesus People that could once again, as it seemed to do in the late 60s and early 70s, offer evangelical Christianity a way to impact its culture and the coming generation of young people. In the current polarized cultural and political atmosphere of red and blue America, that seems like a pretty tall order. But the gulf between the conservative silent majority types within the Baptist subculture and the alienated hippies and druggies of the 60s, that gulf was surely large, if not larger. The longing for revival lives hard within conservative Christian ranks. As Alvin Reed, professor of evangelism at Southeastern Baptist Seminary, wrote just a couple months back, it is hard to imagine the contemporary church at the start of the third millennium without the Jesus movement's effects. And it is hard for me not to become excited at the possibility for a movement of God among students today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for some questions. I know that probably a few of you need to get on to other appointments, and so you can head out now if you need to. But ready for a few,
Sure.
questions?
Yeah, come on. If you have. Yes,
Larry,
Dr. Hankins.
Baptists as a denominational group, since you were focusing on them today, how do they compare with the influences of the other evangelical denominations, either mainline or smaller?
Generally, the Baptists were actually maybe a little more enthusiastic about it. You have individual pastors from some of the other denominations who jumped on from the Evangelical Free Church and some of the other Midwestern sort of evangelical groups. But a lot of the, particularly, and this is maybe somewhat surprising, the Pentecostal denominations were very hesitant to embrace the Jesus People group. The Assemblies of God would maybe have been the one exception. They began, of any of those groups, they were ones who sort of said, kind of the mentality of John Bisagno and Walker Knight. They said, let's glom on to this, the message doesn't change, but the methods do, so we'll, change our methods to reach these people. So And then, of course, most fundamentalist Baptist groups, yeah, not so big on these folks. Yes.
We were in Houston in the 70s.
Okay.
We were at Sporino every single night.
There you go.
But I was wondering, I went from there to the college and into seminary, and seminary numbers at Southwestern Seminary were swelling pretty big at that time. And I'm wondering the ways in which there was sort of a wave of people moving in sort of institutionalized ways
Absolutely.
into
Yeah.
Baptist ministry at the
Yeah.
result of this.
This is a kind of a serious aspect. There were a lot of people who were seriously converted during this movement and who went on. I don't have numbers. It's more of an informal sense. It was like that was one of the things I didn't chase and probably should have. One of those looking back, wish I would have. Sort of thing, but in all the evangelical seminaries and, like you say, in some of these Baptist seminaries, you hear that same report. Richard Lovelace at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary back then said, most of his new people coming in the late 70s were, coming out of the Jesus People movement in one way or the other, and which helped spur him. He was a guy who studied revivalism in particular. So, yeah, that was a real force. And it's interesting when you begin listening to people's anecdotes about, of our generation, you begin to start scratching underneath the surface, and I was involved with this group and that. It's pretty amazing. Yeah, that really was a impact. Yes.
Do you think that it kind of opened Baptist ecumenical eyes, this Jesus revolution? Because we were growing up in Houston, and one of the kind of more important Jesus movement groups there was in a charismatic Episcopalian.
Oh yeah, Polkingham. Yeah.
And it kind of just the Jesus movement provided a kind of big umbrella for a lot of different.
Yeah, one of the major, Jesus people, kind of like their hippie contacts, why do we let these divisions divide us? There was definitely an on-the-ground ecumenism that was present with these groups, and, it was hard to find a group that was strictly denominational. And you began to find that most of these groups shed any sort of denominational connection or relationship. I know just from I was involved in this back in the day up in the Chicago area. At our group, we had a couple of Assemblies of God kids, Lutheran Church Wisconsin Synod kids, Baptists, of different stripes, and of course independent people, and so it was pretty much a working grassroots ecumenical sort of attitude that was there, and I'm sure it did impact general attitudes. Yes.
To what extent did the reassimilation of people into mainline churches have to do with class structure? Because the Jesus movement had cadres. There was a sort of a well-educated group that were very oriented towards the arts. There were a lot of working class kids who looked at the options at home, being an assistant in the garage, and just took off.
Yeah.
And it has often struck me that Southern Baptists had a problem with their middle class core. That had to do with issues other than the immediate messages of the movement.
Okay. Yeah, these things tended to find their own level in some degree about the whole arty sort of thing. That almost bespoke the larger your involvement with the counterculture, the odds are more that you had already been, you had that countercultural connection. That a lot of the middle class church kids, on the other hand, were looking for something a little more functional, and this was a way to give them peace and happiness and ticket to heaven, and that sort of thing. Yes, sir.
I was wondering if you could speak on the role of race in general, but also I'm curious if there's any interaction with the Black Power movement at that time.
Like the hippie counterculture, this is generally a white sort of a movement, but because of what they're coming out of, speaking to some colleagues here at lunchtime, and was saying, these weren't people who were kluxers, or who were sympathetic to that sort of thing. So there's a very open attitude towards including other people of other races. Whether they wanted to join that or not, whether the African Americans wanted to link up with that, it was a different question. the only interaction I've seen with Black Power movement specifically, just sort of mentions that, it was an adversarial sort of a thing. There was a group in Chicago that would, sort of deal with some of these people occasionally. And I remember there was a group in Berkeley, California called the Christian World Liberation Front. It was one of the great names of all time. Love these guys because before they rallied for Billy Graham, they bedecked a bus with the banner that said "People's Committee to Investigate Billy Graham," to attract the Berkeley radicals on board. But they were particularly, they singled out some of the black radicals in Oakland and Berkeley and kind of yanked their chains occasionally. In some written stuff I saw. But that group is also interesting because although they started out pretty conservative, the roots who started this Christian World Liberation Front were Campus Crusade, so pretty conservative group. But after being in Berkeley a few years, they began to move leftward, and for some of their people were definitely unrecognizable as the type of folks who would have been involved with the group at the start. So yeah, not a whole lot of interaction with Black Power particularly. Yes, sir.
You made a couple mentions of the Children of God.
Ah, yes, okay. Yeah.
Give us a little bit more of that.
Okay. Children of God were a group started in Huntington Beach, California, by a guy who was an ex-Christian and Missionary Alliance pastor, who created a very authoritarian group, and they were one of the biggest early Jesus people groups, and they received a lot of coverage because they liked to do publicity events that attracted attention. They would invade, quote unquote straight churches. And when we use that term, we're talking not sexuality, but we're talking, in terms of being conservative cultural people. They would invade these straight churches with demonstrations. They had this great thing they used to do. They would dress in sackcloth and ashes. And one of their big events was at a Texas A&M football game, actually. I don't know who they were playing, but they stood there with scripture passages hung down and, very King James looking sort of text, and with their staves, and were just silent as people would walk by, and then would march and hit their staffs and go whoa, whoa, just the street theater sort of thing. Anyway, they turned out to be very authoritarian. The controversy over deprogramming, where people would be kidnapped, really sort of first arose with this Children of God group. People would kidnap members of these because they thought the kids were being brainwashed, and they really did sort of inspire the early 70s anti-cult boom, because people said, oh, this is what will happen. Charles Manson, Children of God, same sort of, it's a religious version of that. And so they eventually were forced mostly to generally flee the country. And their leader, David Berg, became very controversial. He had these missives he would send out every week called Mo letters, which had some things which were not exactly Orthodox Christian theology, small o, and eventually they got into some very bizarre sexual practices. The one that really got the headlines in the late 70s was called flirty fishing, when groups in the Caribbean would try to attract young males to the group by offering, attention, So yeah, so the Children of God were this group, which at the first were sort of accepted as a mainline Jesus people group, and eventually it's kind of this evangelical, authorities sort of looked at them and they decided that, okay, we got to make sure these guys are pushed out, they're not labeled an authentic Jesus people group. So yeah, that's one of those contextual. Okay. Anything else?
Okay, well, let's thank Dr. Eskridge again.
Thank you.